Today, we're going to talk about constraint. I could spell it. We can talk about it. Okay, constraint. Constraint in fiction is how we think about the information that we are giving to the reader. At its core, fiction is really about information management. When to reveal what type of information and how to reveal it. And this is where constraint comes in. It's not, oh, I don't want to tell them this just yet, although certainly that is a consideration, when to reveal who the killer actually is. If you do it at the beginning of the book, that's going to be a radically different story than doing it at the end of the book. But that's not what we're talking about here. Instead, we're talking about a more formal kind of constraint. Formal meaning that it plays with the form and plays with the way that you actually write something. The most basic constraint you're told from your probably first class taking creative writing is to show, not tell. Meaning that you want to use sensory details to bring the reader into the world and not tell them about the world. Right? You want to let the reader have the experience through their imagination, not simply tell them what is going on. And this is a constraint, right? This is a very basic constraint. You are going to show, you are not going to tell. And since you are all now in fiction, this isn't always true. There are certainly ways that you can tell a story that work out magnificently. However, how you do it is up to you. So, think of constraints in this way. Rules that you set for yourself that you are now going to work around in your writing. That's the kind of constraint that we are talking about now. And you can make up any kind of constraint. Whereas texture, right, these two, you might be saying, oh, this sounds kind of related. And they are related. There's certainly overlap between constraining yourself and adding texture to a piece. But texture is about borrowing the form of something else, borrowing the language and the vocab of something else. Constraints aren't necessarily formal in that you have to borrow something else, although there is, again, constraint there. If you choose a menu, like several of you did, for your exercise, suddenly you're constrained to the form and the language of a menu. So there is constraint there, but constraint can go beyond that. And that's what I want to talk about now. There is an example, a couple of examples I'm going to tell you of constraint. Okay? One is William Gaddis's. He wrote a book called JR, which when someone asked, what does JR stand for? He said, commonly it stands for junior. So that tells you the kind of writer that Gaddis was. But JR is a novel that has a serious constraint to it. This novel is, I have it right here, 700 some odd pages long. And it is only dialogue. Unattributed dialogue most of the time. No dialogue tags. So you learn who's saying what by the way that they speak. And the entire 700-page novel is told through this dialogue. That's a constraint. How do you tell a story? Through only dialogue. A 700-page comedy, of all things. And we might be reading a little bit of this one when we talk about dialogue a little later in the semester. But that's something for you to think about. Can you tell a story with only dialogue and not use dialogue tags? That's the key, right? You don't even know who's saying what, and you as the reader have to figure it out by the way that they speak. That's a constraint. Another constraint that I thought might be interesting is, let me pull this up, this book called Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar. Now this one has a little bit of texture to it, and we'll talk about how. But it starts with this page, and the top is cut off here. But it's a page, it is titled The Table of Instructions, which is hilarious, right? How to read this book. And it says, essentially, you can stop the video and read this to yourself, that there are two ways to read this book. One is when you hit the end of chapter 56, which happens on, say, page 323. But then you keep flipping and you realize there's 600 pages in the book. So there's about 200 pages after the end of the novel. What the heck is going on with that? And that's when Hopscotch really reveals its constraint. And that is that Cortázar wrote this in such a way that you can read it two different ways. One is by reading chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, right, all the way to 56. The other is by doing the hopscotch component. So he has numbered all of his chapters, and you jump between them, and this makes a different type of narrative. It's a different story contained in the same book. So this is a constraint. He had to write these sections in a way that you could read them in different orders and they would still make sense. There's a constraint for you. So that's something for you to think about. What order can you tell your story in, and are there other orders? And you can invite the reader to then do it. I said this is a little bit of texture, right? There's definitely overlap. And this book is called Hopscotch. And this is supposed to invoke the idea of skipping like you would during a game of hopscotch. So that's something to think about, right? Another constraint, writing sections that can be understood multiple ways. There are two other examples. These are the ones we're going to be reading this week. One is called Ray of the Star by Laird Hunt. He teaches down at DU. He's left now. I can't remember where he's gone. Fantastic writer. The other one is, of course, Georges Perec of Void, who I absolutely adore. And I'm not going to tell you what the constraints are for these two novels. Instead, I've given you excerpts of them, and part of your reading for this week and discussion is to actually figure out what those constraints are. Because once you notice a constraint in a book, it can be empowering. Like, oh my goodness, look at what this author's actually doing. So I'm going to let you discover that for yourself. So this is something for you to think about. What rules do you set for yourself as a writer? How are you going to tell your story? And you can tell it in a lot of different ways. But what constraints do you want to put on yourself? And these can be constraints of any variety. It can be constraints of the narrator. It can be constraints inside language. It can be formal constraints. But if you suddenly create rules that you have to work around, that can be an exciting thing as a writer and a reader, because it's not the same old stories that we hear over and over again. Instead, it's the same old story told in a different way, because, again, it's abiding by rules. The writer's abiding by rules. And because of that, learning to work around those rules. So those can make you a stronger writer as well. So there you go. There's something for you to think about before spring break. Constraints. What constraints can you put into your writing that might bring it to life?